you so much. I'm absolutely delighted to be here tonight. I'm really honored. I'm even very grateful to all these students who allowed themselves to be coerced into coming to this lecture. So good for you, because this is an amazing college that you attend. Everybody has been so gracious to me during my visit today, and I think it's remarkable that you've put into place this lecture series and this chair in Jewish law. I want to acknowledge, I went on the website, tell me more about College of Idaho, and you're all winners. You got Rhodes Scholars, you've got Marshall Scholars, and then the people I met today prove that you're just champions in your heart. I know why that's all true. It's all true because that guy, right? Let's give him a hand. He's hiding back here. But I went online, I did my homework. I didn't do my spelling so well, but I did my homework, right? To find out more about this extraordinary person and to watch him teach and to know the type of love of learning that he and the other professors have instilled here. So again, from my heart and all of those who come from the crazy place called Los Angeles, thank you for inviting me. A special thank you to the president, Marv Henberg, of this university for spending time with me and showing me what a great group of faculty, and to your vice president and even the secretarial staff. It takes a village to create the type of learning you have here. So let me give you an idea of what I'm going to do tonight. I'm actually going to start this class the way I do all of my law school classes, and that means you're going to have to repeat after me in your loudest, clearest voice, whatever I say. Are you ready? Here we go. I love the law. Praise be the law. The law giveth and provideth. And the law taketh away. Indeed, I am going to talk today about the law. And as I mentioned, I come from a very strange planet. It's called Hollywood land, right? And we have lots of trials of the century in Hollywood land. It is true that today I was on the Today Show. I taped it yesterday because we had this case involving a guy named Michael Jackson and what his family should get paid. And law can get distorted. But I would sit there and watch trial after trial after trial after trial. And I would be thinking, and Lindsay Lohan herself has many trials, right? And on occasion, I'd get a phone call from Lance Armstrong who wanted me to know that he never used any performance enhancement drugs. And yes, I met Michael Jackson before he passed away. I sat through the trial. He came in his pajamas one day. Who knew I wore a suit? Nobody told me. Kobe Bryant, and of course Barry Bonds, and the OJ and Dr. Murray. And I would sit through these cases as well as many more, because women commit crimes too. Martha Stewart, we have an upcoming case from the Boston Marathon, and then we have Snowden, Jared Lochner, who did the terrible shooting, James Holmes from Aurora. That's called Bernie Madoff, a $1 billion fraud, and Enron. And as I would watch these schmutzy, that's a legal term, schmutz, right? I would watch these schmutzy trials, I say, there's got to be something more about the law, something more meaningful about the law that I can get out of these cases. And I would sit in the courtroom, and I brought with me a Torah that's in a written book form called a tikkun, and that has all the words of the tikkun so I could study the 5 books of Moses while the schmutz is going on. And it would be in Hebrew, because I had good teachers, I could read Hebrew. And one day, in the OJ case, Judge Ito sent his bailiff over and said, the judge wants to know what you're reading. And he said, is it a secret code? And I thought about it, and I said, yes, it is a secret code. Because the Bible and the other holy texts and commentaries and laws can elevate even what we're seeing in the law today. And I realized that there's a way to look at contemporary legal issues through a different lens. And you don't have to be Jewish to understand why our laws are today the way they are. And you can take things like the paparazzi, right? Who you look at and say they're just gossip mongers, and say, what role should that have? And Jewish law says something about it. It shouldn't. We have a term called lashon hara I'm going to talk about. There's a difference between information and gossip. And you could look at all of these cases involving the athletic stars, and you could ask, what do they tell us about deeper meaning? And you might start thinking about idol worshiping and how we have laws from ancient texts that are designed to deal with that. So in fact, my topic for tonight is going to be the connection between Jewish ethics and Jewish law and Western ethics and Western law. Now, I'm not going to be talking about all American laws, nor am I suggesting that they all came from only Jewish laws, and I'm not saying that only Jewish laws are better. But the truth is, American law is from a Judeo-Christian background, and it's being informed now, as it should be, by other cultures as well. The other thing I want to say is I'm not really talking about the laws of Israel. It is true that many of the laws in Israel are based upon these Jewish laws, but that's not the focus of my talk. If you have questions later on, we can talk about it. I'm talking about the broader connection between the traditions in Jewish law and Western and American law. Now, this is easy. You're already sitting there, oh God, she's no great shakes. I get it. It's a no-brainer, right? So if you open up your Idaho Penal Code, it probably says you should not kill. It's a crime to commit murder. And you'd say, oh, where did that come from? And you know the answer of where that came from. Long before there was a penal code, there were things called the Ten Commandments. Moses revealed the law, and there's been law revealed since then. But we're going to go even deeper to that and talk about something I'm going to refer to as halacha. This is the Jewish term for the collection of law and the collection of ethics. And it's never simple, because the one thing that's great about this is that it's always developing. Let me start with some basics. I want to start talking about one of my greatest teachers, my father. And my father was not a lawyer. He hated lawyers. He was a doctor, right? And he was Jewish, but I don't think he believed in God. What he did believe in is what we call mitzvot, commandments, the traditions and the rules. And it was his theory that if you live according to the laws, you will be a good person, you'll be a person of faith. It may be at the end of his life he did believe more in God, but that wasn't really his lessons to us. His lesson was to look to the law for how you will interact with others. So now I'm going to put up something, and you're going to say, wow, what does that have to do with the law? What is that, anybody? It's a pomegranate. And so do you know, over this side over here, how many seeds are in a pomegranate? Where's my math majors? How many seeds? Well, the tradition says there's 613 seeds in a pomegranate. And what does that have to do with anything? We have a pomegranate as Jews that we put in our booths that we sit in during a holiday called Sukkot. It's a harvest festival. And we have a pomegranate, because 613 seeds reminds us of the 613 mitzvot, or commandments of laws, that can guide us in our lives. That leads us then to, if we have this constant reminder, so if you're going to eat the law, you got to follow the law, why ethics and laws matter. Now, I know you think it matters because you might end up in jail, or, ooh, it'll hurt your permanent record. But there are really more important reasons. Morality defines law, and law defines morality. Okay, if you really want a moral society, is it enough to go around and say, be kind, be honest, be fair? Will that get you anywhere? It's not a bad start, but it's not enough in itself. So if you believe that we should not oppress the orphan or the widow, you probably need property laws to make sure you cannot. And if you believe that people should be fair in business, right, you need laws, intricate laws, on how you are going to do the balancings and the fair measures of business. And if you want respect for individuals, then you need laws that talk about defamation and when you can say falsehoods. The next thing, law helps to actualize moral ideals. What do I mean by that? We have, under Jewish tradition, and I'll talk about this later, laws of war. And you must be thinking, laws of war? Isn't war by definition the state of chaos? How can you have laws of war? But you can, and you need. You need at the time of the biggest crisis, when the questions are most difficult to answer, to have something to go back and say, here's how you approach it. Here's how you get to the answer that you hope you would have. And that's going to be through law. Law provides a forum for weighing conflicting morals and values and setting moral priorities, right? So let me see. Is it a moral priority not to kill? Raise your hand, right? Is it also a moral priority not to be killed? So that leads to some interesting questions. We're going to talk about the Trayvon Martin Zimmerman case. It's got both morals. How do you balance out? How do you prioritize those morals? And finally, the law gives moral norms a sense of the immediate and the real. It's almost a security blanket. Things will not fall completely apart as long as we can reach out and say there are at least some laws that we're all going to follow. So I want to look at first the sources of Jewish law. This is not on the exam. I'm going to give you some of the basics here. Here we go. Jewish law. We've got lots of sources. We have the written Torah. That's known as the 5 books of Moses. And there are lots of laws in those books. If you've ever sat down and read Deuteronomy, there are lots of laws, including, let me see, we've got thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not steal, and thou shalt not shtup your neighbor's wife. Does everybody know what that means? You're alone then? Shtup. Repeat after me. Shtup. Okay, you've learned. All right. So you have some basic rules, and if you ever need them, there are even rules in those books on how to deal with leprosy. I hope you never need it. But that's not the end of it. And for traditional Jews, they believe that those books themselves were written directly from God. But Jewish law is not set in stone, nor is it set just in heaven. The tradition is it continues to be created through us. And we have that responsibility. We can't turn back and say that people who lived thousands of years ago gave us the answer to all our questions. Because I'm going to guess they had no idea how to deal with some of the technology or the issues we have today. And law evolves, and it's the best of all tradition. What is the best thing about Jewish law? We get to fight. Or I should put it this way, debate. It's actually really important not to agree, to test each other, to push each other, to do the type of learning I'm going to guess some of your teachers would like you to do right here in the college, to ask the hard questions. And so when you read Jewish texts, you will see Rabbi so-and-so says this, Rabbi other says that, and sometimes they'll have one who wins, but the important part was the debate. So we have something called the oral Torah, and there are 2 main bodies. There was the Mishnah and the Gemara. And the Mishnah and Gemara were put together into what we call the Talmud. But like many other things Jewish, you can't have just one. You have the Jerusalem Talmud, and you have the Babylonian Talmud, and those were very much based upon the different Gemaras. One was Western Aramaic and one was Eastern Aramaic that was put in there. And this is a collection of discussions and commentaries by rabbis. Now, you're saying, well, but those guys lived a long time ago. What would they know? And I tell my students a lot. The fact that somebody lived long ago and didn't know how to use your iPad doesn't mean that they didn't understand human nature and the nature of law. There is a rich amount of tradition and law to be learned. So that's a huge source, and Jews will spend their entire lives studying the Talmud. Post-Talmudic codifications. After the Talmud, we continue to study the laws and put them together, codify them. We'll talk about a great learned scholar, Rabbi Maimonides, and how he put together the Mishnah Torah and the rules. He wrote a philosophical work called The Guide for the Perplexed, which I think should probably be something that every student has, right? The Guide for the Perplexed. And someone by the name of Joseph Caro, who lived back in 1563, who wrote his codification, and it was called the Shulchan Aruch. What does Shulchan Aruch mean? It literally means set the table. When you put the laws out in front of you, the everyday laws, what are they going to look like? How are you going to use them? Then we have different codifiers from different traditions, the Tosafists, the German school, the Italian codifiers. We continue to have rabbinical interpretations, or what we call responsa to this day. And then it's even part of Jewish law, something we call the minhag, the customs. So there's the Jewish law that's written, and there's the Jewish law that you practice every single day. I want to go back to this fellow I mentioned, the great rabbi Maimonides, who's also known for the letters of his name in Hebrew, Rambam. And this guy was pretty amazing. Look when he lived, 1135 to 1204, Moshe ben Maimon, and he was born in Cordoba. But it was not a good time for Jews in Cordoba, Spain, at the time. They were being forced to convert. So his family fled. They went to Morocco, and then he went to Cairo, Egypt. Raise your hand if you've heard any of this kind of before. Excellent, you've been studying. And he was one of the great codifiers of the law. He was, as I would say, a classic overachiever. You know, the guy in your class that you just can't believe because he was the greatest rabbi, he was a physician, and he was a philosopher, he had traveled, and he wrote a 14-volume treatise on the law. He knew what he was talking about. Now, you know, in my criminal law class, I often refer to the people who codify or make our laws, let's say in Congress, as numbnuts. This week in particular, repeat after me, numbnuts. Rambam was no numbnut. Rambam was holy, and he was very learned, and he left us with these laws that we study to this day. And you know, believe it or not, all of you in this room know some Rambam, and I want to show you. Here we go. Maimonides said, "It is better and more satisfactory to acquit 1,000 guilty persons than to put a single innocent one to death." What does that sound like, people? Does it sound like our presumption of innocence? How about this one? Nobody is liable to 2 punishments for 1 offense. What does that sound like, everybody? Double jeopardy. We think we're so smart. This comes from Jewish law. And Maimonides Rambam also looked at the qualifications. He said, you know, the people who sit on these cases, it's really important that they have the qualities of people that we want to judge. So here are the qualities that he wanted to see in judges. Judges must be wise and sensible, learned in the law and full of knowledge, and also acquainted to some extent with other subjects such as medicine, arithmetic, astronomy, and astrology, and for the lawyers we see in some of our high-profile cases, and the ways of sorcerers and magicians and the absurdities of idolatry. And before you say that doesn't really apply anymore, think of some of the judges we have, right? But that's not what we want. We want people who really are of the highest quality and who will inspire us and our students today. And it was Maimonides who put together that list of important attributes. Actually, his 7 fundamental qualities of a judge are wisdom, humility, think if you agree these, wisdom, humility, fear of God, disdain of money, love of truth, love of people, and a good reputation. Isn't that the judge you'd like to have? And Maimonides had an influence on Christian philosophers and others who have contributed to the Western civilization of law. So you have St. Aquinas and Maimonides who would speak through their writings on similar topics. That's an overview. It's certainly not a perfect fit, the connection between Jewish law and history and American law, but you'll begin to see the roots of some of our law. The other thing I'm not saying, I'm not disregarding the separation of church and state. I very much believe in the separation of church and state. But we are fools if we don't recognize where our laws come from and that we can get deeper meaning of our laws by understanding that. And so I'm going to give you a sampler, a little bit of a smorgasbord, just a taste tonight, of some of areas in American law and their roots in Jewish law. And then, of course, it'll be up to you to go study more about it. I'm going to start with Jewish law and the environment. You know, I mentioned that thing called a sukkah. It's a holiday that comes right after Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, these very important spiritual holidays, where Jews actually, we build one in my home, right? Go outside and we build one of these temporary shelters where you can't help but notice. You're just one person. You're just one thing in bigger nature. And it's universalistic. You know what I'm saying? Relates to everybody in the universe. And it relates to protecting our environment as well. So, Jewish law actually does speak to environmental law. All the way back to the tradition that God created man and woman, right? God created Adam. God created Adam and everything in the garden. And it was God who said, you can have all of this, well, maybe not that tree, but you can have all of it. And it is ours temporarily to use. It is on loan to us. And what we need while we're here, we can use. But God never said, you can have it and then destroy it for future generations, right? It's yours, and you don't have to worry about it being anyone else's. And because of that tradition, that what we have was not something we made, but was given to us, and that we are the stewards for it, there are Jewish laws on how to treat the land. And under those Jewish laws, there's something called Shemitah. There's a sabbatical. You give your land a sabbatical. Now, many of you come from more agricultural backgrounds than us folks in Los Angeles, but you probably recognize that's a good idea, right? You have to let your land lay fallow for a while in order to get better crops. You're not the first to recognize that. That's in the Torah. That's in the Bible. And that the idea that the land itself needs to have a chance to replenish. There are laws on eminent domain. What is eminent domain? That's when the community needs your land more than you might. And it said that there are communal rights. Even in the first Mishnah, it said that. And there are laws against pollution in the Talmud. Talmud tells the story that somebody who had a millstone was grinding their wheat, and their noise and their tremors were affecting the neighbors. And the Talmud teaches you can't do that. You cannot pollute the environment in which others live. And protection against ecological damage even overrides the sanctity of contracts. And in Jewish law, contracts are really important. What is the most important contract under Jewish law? There's actually two really important ones. We even see ourselves as a Jewish people in a covenant, in a contract with God. But the other big contract, at least in my life, is my marriage contract. My husband was a little nervous when he realized that he would have to negotiate with me, even though he's a lawyer. But we get married under a contract. Environment and anti-pollution is so important that it even trumps contracts that might have been made on this issue. And it even gets kind of earthy. It gets into the nitty-gritty. You know, there are laws on, toilets. Where you can build toilets so as it doesn't bother others. Where it's going to harm people. Zoning laws, emissions, so that you can protect the environment. Let's try another area. Jewish laws of speech. So no, there's not a First Amendment, but there are things that guide us. First of all, Jewish law says very clearly you cannot slander someone. Remember I said that's Lashon Hara? And you can't spread false information. In fact, you can't spread true information that is designed to damage someone's reputation. And it's a crime akin with murder. Why? Because people can't get their reputations back, just like your life. So it was considered very, very serious, and you would have to watch your speech. But look what happens. There's also a tradition that you have a responsibility to speak out. So the tradition is not all that you can't speak. Sometimes you have the responsibility to speak out, to literally reprove your kinsmen, to help your community if you see things that are unjust. And these two provisions both come from Leviticus. If you read the first one, it says, "Thou shalt not go up and down as a talebearer among thy people." No gossiping. You know who you are. The next one, next line after it, says, "Thou shalt not hate thy brother in thy heart. Thou shalt surely rebuke thy neighbor and not bear sin because of him." In other words, if your neighbor is doing something wrong, if he or she is harming someone else, you cannot sit idly by. Jewish law actually does put a high value on speech. And some of you might know that there were great rabbis of our time who marched with, holding their Torahs, with Martin Luther King Jr. when he marched out and spoke. All right, criminal law. This is my baby. I love criminal law. I spent a decade as a federal prosecutor. It would make my day to put people in prisons, right? And I have a great interest in criminal law and how it relates to Jewish ethics. Well, let's start out with this. You know, the question might be asked, what about punishment? Is it ethical as people for us to punish others? Why don't we just wait for the lightning bolt to come down from heaven and punish instead? Jewish law teaches us it actually is our responsibility to have punishment. But there are also limits and ways to approach it. So many of you know the phrase eye for an eye, the lex talionis, right? Which is an idea of proportionality. Many people think it means an eye for an eye. That would leave everybody blind. It's not what it means. It means, and it was actually a limitation on the type of punishment that was going on in ancient times, that it should be proportional. Because it used to be that when people committed a crime, not only were they punished, but their children and their grandchildren and for generations. So Jewish law brought this concept of proportionality. It also talks about something we call din and rachamim. My first day of criminal law, for all my students, I say, we're going to talk about the rachmanus principle. Try that with me, everybody. Rachmanus. And they all look at me exactly the way you're looking at me right now. And I look back and I say, common spelling. No. What does this mean? It means that there are actually two parts of the law, even with punishment. Din is the harsh law. It's what's in black and white. You should not do this. In other words, you must turn in your paper at exactly this time. That's the din. That's the law. The rachamim is the compassion. So you missed it by a minute. You missed it because you were helping a fellow student, do something. Carry her books, carry his books. And does the professor say, I'm sorry, I'm failing you? Or does the professor say, rachamim, compassion, I understand? Jewish law builds into the law this idea that it has to have both. And then Jewish law also has this concept we call teshuvah, which literally means to return. The goal of punishment is not just to hurt people, to make them feel the pain. It's to get them to return to be the type of people you want them to be. Concepts from Jewish law. I then actually want to add this. When is a person criminally responsible? That's from Jewish law as well. The idea that the Talmud says no person is criminally responsible for any act unless he did that act willfully. In other words, you have to have intentionally committed the crime. And you're saying, oh yeah, that makes sense. Who would ever have it another way? Is there anybody here who knows much about Cherokee Nation law? I'll tell you about Cherokee Nation law. My students have to learn that too. We are not the only way law happens in society. Under Cherokee Nation law, they do not have a concept of fault. So, if one person from one tribe kills another person of another tribe, the killer, need not suffer the punishment. There just needs to be a balance of nature, which means since you took from the second tribe, somebody from the first tribe has to be sacrificed. And maybe it'll be old grandma if she's not up to snuff, right? It is Jewish law that said, no. The concept of fault, of culpability, of willfulness, of making that choice to do something wrong, that's what gives you the authority to punish. Degrees of homicide, that comes from Jewish law. Under even the Torah, there were different types of slayers. There would be the premeditated slayer, and then there would be the accidental killers. And the accidental killers could run away to what we called cities of refuge and kind of hide out until the high priest died, because the blood avengers, the family of the victims, would chase after them. And it was Jewish law who said, no, it's not the same to have an accidental killer as an intentional killer. And now we're going to talk about self-defense. How many of people have heard of the case of Trayvon Martin and George Zimmerman? And it's a little controversial, right? People have mixed feelings about the verdict. But I want to look at it under Jewish law. Here's what the Talmud says. If someone comes to kill you, rise up and kill him first. Because life is valuable, and the life of an innocent is more valuable than the life of an aggressor. That is Jewish law. The hard thing in that case was what? Did Zimmerman reasonably fear that his life was in danger? If he reasonably feared his life was in danger, not only did he have the right, but he had the responsibility, he had the law, the duty to use self-defense. The jury had to figure that out. And much of this discussion of stand your ground laws, do you remember that? Missed the point. But the media often misses the point. issue, you can only stand your ground if you have a reasonable fear of your life. It goes back to this basic principle. The problem with toting stand your ground laws is people lose sight of that, right? They forget this basic principle. If the jury is correct, I let you decide that George Zimmerman reasonably did fear for his life. He didn't know what Trayvon Martin was up to. He had been beaten up and pushed down on the pavement. The ballistics showed that when Trayvon was shot, and that is tragic, but when he was shot, he was over Zimmerman because his sweatshirt was away from his body. If a jury finds on that evidence that Zimmerman reasonably feared, that at least under the Talmud, that would be a proper use of self-defense. A warning, what I call missing links. We've been talking about the link between Jewish law and Western law, Jewish ethics and Western ethics. But that often gets distorted in discussions that we can hear. And I see it distorted so often in discussions of the death penalty. A lot of people say we should have the death penalty. The Bible talks about the death penalty. And that's the only level of discussion it gets to. But that's not enough. Because that's a link, it's not enough of a link. What people don't tend to understand is that in the Bible and under Jewish law, yeah, there's capital punishment, but not in a way that ever resembles what's happening here today. The crimes were limited, but more importantly, the procedural protections. So did you know that under Jewish law, in order to execute someone, you had to have 2 witnesses to the crime, and they had to warn the defendant before he committed the murder? What's your name? Yeah, Kyle. So they'd have to say, Kyle, don't do that. I'm telling you, Kyle, if you do it, you're going to get the death penalty. And then, heaven forbid, Kyle goes off and does it anyways. That's how hard it was under Jewish law to use the death penalty. And they had the great Sanhedrin, the body of judges, the rabbis, who would decide these cases. And they had unusual procedures. Did you know that when the 70 judges would sit on the case, if they all came back at once and said guilty, that was a bad verdict? Why would that be a bad verdict? They're all unanimous. And the answer was because they didn't try hard enough to find something good in the defendant. They didn't look at the case close enough. What is the lesson from this? We have links, but those procedural backgrounds make us think an awful lot about how we use those traditions today. Property law. Jewish law obviously talks about property law, and even in antiquity, there were no distinctions of classes within the Jewish nation. All Israelites were considered full citizens, and even Gentiles were considered persons under the law. But they did have this little problem called slavery. Not good. And that's not a proud moment. Unless, of course, you put it in context. Because Jewish law had laws of slavery, which were designed to sort of say, keep it as minimal as possible. And one of the laws was you had to choose to become a slave. You got the choice. And if you decided you wanted to be a slave, you have to be offered to go, then you had to show you really meant it. You had to put some skin in the game, literally. And the skin in the game is the way somebody was marked as a slave, is that they were held up next to the post on their doorpost, and an nail was driven through their ear, an earring, to mark them as a slave. But that is something somebody chose to mark themselves at. Jewish law did not favor slavery. It recognized under the times that it existed and tried to make it a bit more humane. Under Jewish law, there are personal versus real property rights. We would go over them, but we would never leave here tonight. And even concepts called bailment or mortgages or liens or easements or stealing larceny are spelled out with great, great detail. In the Torah itself, in the Bible, it talks about, in Genesis, property transactions to buy caves and burial places. Business ethics and Jewish law. You know what? Jewish law has always been well aware of the inclination towards greed. You know, a Bernie Madoff is no huge surprise. They have been around forever. In fact, a commentator, Chazal, said, one who has 100 wants 200. And that people who have a greedy inclination, you got to be aware of. In fact, my rabbi never tires of telling this joke. You want to hear the joke? Yeah. So a man is on Yom Kippur, the holiest day of the year. We fast. We're supposed to be deep into prayer, not worrying about food. So you got a man, he's at temple and he's fasting, and he says to the rabbi, "Oh, Rabbi, I'm dying. You got to feed me." And the congregant, the rabbi, says, "Well, we'll feed you if you give us 500 rubles." And the guy says, "Oh, I'm feeling much better now." There's these issues under Jewish law of dealing with people who they really are. And that's what I like about it, is that we don't pretend people are anything more than we are, and we try to put the laws in place. We have laws against thieves and robbers. We have laws against embezzlement. We have laws against antitrust. You're saying, really? Antitrust laws? Have any of you been to the Middle East area and seen bazaars in the Middle East? You're from Lebanon? No. Palestine. Okay. So there are bazaars where you have a lot of people, right, selling the same goods. And you might be saying, why are they all selling the same goods? You know, why don't you have one garment dealer? We would call them shmata dealers. One person who's selling clothing, one person who's selling spices, one person selling... Why everybody? And that actually comes from the tradition of the ancient laws, that you could not limit people, and you could not say to somebody, you get a monopoly over this area of trade, because we want everyone to have an opportunity. The Talmud says, a fisherman must distance himself from his neighbor's nets. Everyone gets the opportunity. And there are laws for fair advertising. In the discussion of the rules of the Mishnah, it says, the hair of a slave may not be dyed black to make him younger, nor may one paint old baskets to make them appear like new. In other words, no cheating, no cheating. However, there is nothing wrong with painting new ones to make them look their best. You go ahead and do your best. You say, well, that does sound familiar, right? You can't cheat on your laws. That is not the law of every tradition. What was Roman law when it came to, these advertisements and the like? Have you ever heard buyer beware? That was Roman law. So Jewish law chose another path. Jewish law had laws to protect against the receipt of stolen property. By and large, you could not buy property from a shepherd. Why? Why? Shepherds are roaming all around. They get goods from different people. They don't live in an area where they would necessarily know who those goods belong to. And heaven forbid, you're then getting stolen property. And likewise, there were laws against buying things at night, because the type of transactions that happen at night, not as kosher as the ones during the day. Very practical reminders. The last thing I'm often asked about are loans. There's this image of Jews as moneylenders, and not particularly flattering ones if you've ever read Shakespeare. But that's a misrepresentation, isn't it? Because nothing in the Bible, it says you cannot charge interest. You cannot be a usurer. But nothing says you cannot make a loan. In fact, it encourages you to make a loan. Just don't make yourself rich off making the loans. Jews were pushed into money laundering and money lending, hopefully not money laundering, by certain political movements that happened much later. All right, we zip through laws of inheritance. When my students take the bar exam, I say just memorize numbers. Because this isn't it, very close to American law. And thou shalt speak unto the children of Israel, saying, if a man die and have no son, then he shall cause his inheritance to pass into his daughter, and if he has no daughter, it shall go to his brethren, and if he has no brethren, it should go to his kinsmen, and then it goes to all the people of Israel. Now, I don't so much love that part about it goes first to the son, right? Not so good. But there are stories and laws on that as well. There was a tradition that we have even in our wills and trust law today. Human rights law. See if you recognize any of these. The right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That comes from Jewish law. Right to privacy. The right to be let alone was from Louis Brandeis, who was the first Jewish justice on the Supreme Court. It really comes from a Talmudic concept that there were rules against entering another person's home without permission, even to collect debts. There is sacred space. Your dorm room, sacred space. Well, maybe not yours. A right to reputation. The freedom of movement, right? In the Bible it says, go to the land I will show you. Those guys are moving all the time. The right to asylum. The right to marry and found a family. And the right of equality, which comes essentially from the idea that every person is created in God's image. And Thomas Paine, we all know who Thomas Paine was, right? He wrote, the equality of man, so far from being a modern doctrine, is the oldest upon record. Because he had read Leviticus that said, ye shall have one manner of law. All right, with all that said, I'm going to get to a tough topic. And this is very difficult to look at. I actually hope it is difficult to look at. I hope we haven't become so desensitized that when we see women and children and anybody who has been the victims of chemical warfare, we just don't want to scream out in pain. And yet this isn't from ancient times. This is from our times. And this is from the recent chemical attacks in Syria. And many of us watched and wondered while our nation or our leaders were trying to decide, what do we do about it? Not an easy decision. And some people would say, bomb them. Just go bomb right now. And other people would say, none of our business. They'll work it out. It's their civil war. And I said, why don't we try to think about it from some principles of Jewish law? And then I'll let you make your own decisions. So can I walk you through that with me for just a minute? There were Jewish laws, as I mentioned, on war. Under Jewish law, there is absolutely a duty to pursue peace. And the picture you're looking at here is actually a picture of the paratroopers in Jerusalem who at the side of the Western Wall take their oath. And part of their oath is that they are supposed to operate under these laws of war. Now, I'm not saying everybody's good about it, but it is at least supposed to be something that governs us. So the duty to pursue peace. Obama and the other leaders didn't march out and bomb. They might have had political reasons, but Deuteronomy says, when you approach a city to do battle with it, you should call it to it in peace. And if they respond in peace and they open the city to you, no war. However, if they do not make peace with you, you shall wage war with them and you shall besiege them. So the idea that we would actually try to find a political solution, not so far from what tradition has been. Jewish law had a concept of both obligatory and discretionary law, or authorized and discretionary law. And Maimonides actually thought you had the duty to seek peace in any kind of war. Let me tell you about the difference between the obligatory versus authorized war. Obligatory war is milchemet mitzvah. You've already learned the word mitzvah. What it meant? Commandment. Milchemet, war. You are commanded to do war under certain situations. When are you commanded to do war? When, in fact, it's a defensive war. When you have to protect yourself and you've been attacked the way that Amalek attacked the tribes of Israel, right? So in the Bible, there's a story of a guy, not a good guy, named Amalek, who attacks from the rear. And he attacks the weakest. And in that situation, in all situations, you have a duty to preserve life. And then there are concepts of discretionary war, but the high court had to authorize and you had to debate it under those. Even when you were killing in self-defense, there are some rules. One may not kill an innocent party. One may not kill an enemy just to punish them. And one may not use more force than necessary. There are rules on how you conduct a war. As we said, an obligation to warn the civilian population. Joshua warned Jericho 3 times. I'm coming, I'm coming, I'm coming. And I know Professor Berger does a shofar contest, right? To send out the warning, we're coming. Obligations regarding the conduct during war. When you lay siege to the enemy, do you know what? You had to leave one avenue for them to escape. You could not surround all 4 walls. You could only surround 3 of the walls so that there was a way for the civilian population to get out. There are also rules against destroying fruit trees so that you didn't have unnecessary waste. You didn't destroy that population forever. And you couldn't just pick up the ladies and rape them all. You actually had to give them 30 days to shave their heads and to mourn their losses and then to become a spouse. And you couldn't pillage either. You could take that which you needed to replace what you used in the war. Here's one to think about. Were there limitations on types of weapons? Yeah. How about chemical weapons? You know, the rabbis knew from very early times that there were things called chemical weapons. Do you know what the first example of a chemical weapon was? Where? Anybody? Where? Hemlock? No, that's when you drink it. The first chemical weapons were in Syria. Yes, the same Syria. And that was in 256 Common Era, 206 CE. The Sasanian Persian forces besieged the Roman defenders in Syria. And they dug a tunnel right up to the walls, to the city, and they had some sulfuric and other crystal gases and set them off. And those were chemical weapons. And at that point, the rabbi said, we think of really bad ways to kill each other. So the Talmud actually prohibits waging war in a situation where the casualty rate is going to exceed 1/6 of the population. In other words, if our leaders paused and said, we are worried about what kind of strike we're going to do and how it's going to affect others, that would be under Jewish law. If they paused and said, is this an ethical way to commit a war? That would be under Jewish law. If they said, do we have a political solution and if we have a way to let people get out so they won't be killed? That comes from a tradition. Nuclear weapons, are they kosher? How many say yes? How many say no? They're probably not. But here's the little twist. Nothing in the law says you can't threaten them. They just say you can't use them. So if our enemies would go out and study Jewish law, they'd have a better sense of what we plan or not plan to do. And finally, the other rules allow for conscientious objectors. If you had just gotten married or just planted your vineyard, you didn't have to go to war. You can't take the spoils. You have to remember, and this is the word Amalek in Hebrew. And this is being scratched out. When they first start to write a Torah scroll, has anybody ever seen a Torah scroll? One that they hold up on the holidays? It's written by hand. by a very learned scholar, a Sofer, and before he or she even starts to write it, they write the name Amalek, that really bad guy, on a little piece of paper, and they scratch it out, throw it away, so that we can remember how bad it was. But what we really need to remember is no rejoicing at our victories. You're not allowed to do this. So as scholars, and you can take this back to your dorms or your classrooms or wherever, think a little bit. If you were the president, I'm not suggesting anybody at the White House or in Congress ever read the Talmud and ever, right? But if you were to have read it, might that have helped you, at least on the questions and the answers you were looking for in the time of crisis? All right, we're wrapping things up. There are so many areas where Jewish law has framed the discussions we have today. Active versus passive euthanasia. So it makes a difference, right? Whether you hurry somebody along, time for you to die, as opposed to you let nature take its course. But that's not always such an easy decision. What does that mean? What does that mean in terms of force feeding, providing the medical care, unhooking people? Jewish law struggled with this long before American law did. And it comes down to you cannot, push death. You cannot make it hasten death. But you have no obligation to prolong dying either. And then the devils are in that detail of study. Termination of pregnancies. I teach at a Catholic law school. We debate this all the time, right? Jewish law has a very different ideal of when somebody becomes a full person. Under some circumstances, when the fetus is harming the mother, the rabbis actually wrote that it's permissible to tear it out limb by limb. Is that graphic enough for you? But it's the idea that that baby, or more, I should say, fetus, does not trump the right of the parent. That's not the tradition for everyone, but it's an important thing to focus on when you have the discussion. And then my latest area is the conduct of pharmaceutical companies. We are launched into Obamacare, right? And one of the reasons our health care is so expensive is the cost of drugs. So I said, what would Jewish law tell me about this? And it would say that in fact, if the pharmaceutical companies paid the money for the research, they would be entitled to a fair profit and the cost of developing the goods. But if you and I, through the government, paid for that research, they're not entitled to it. It's not theirs. That's Jewish law. You can think about it. We have all sorts of new lenses on modern law. And the discussion is coming up very much on Ed Snowden and Bradley Manning and others who are revealing the information that it's charged they should not reveal. And I'm asked, well, is that okay for them to do? And again, I'm thinking, well, yeah, Jewish law has this idea of openness and responsibility and tradition, but it also has these contractual obligations. And most of all, it has this idea that what affects you is not the only factor. You have an obligation to the community. With all that said, my friends, probably what I've done best today is to confuse you, as I often do my own students. But I want to leave you sort of where Jewish law has played the greatest role in my life and my students' life. I have the privilege at my law school to run what we call an Innocence Project. Have you ever heard of it, people? And we represent people who claim that they were wrongfully convicted, put in prison for crimes they did not commit, especially people who were put in prison for a lifetime or were facing the death penalty for murders they did not commit. So my client here is this fellow right in the middle. His name is Obie Anthony. Obie Anthony grew up on the streets of LA in gangs, because that's all we've got. And he was 19 years old when he was charged and convicted of a murder. He did not commit the murder. The murder took place outside of a whorehouse. Everybody know what that is? In Los Angeles. And no one was caught the night of the murder. And the LAPD went out and arrested him, and he spent 17 years, from ages 19 to 36, in prison for that crime. But I learned under Jewish law, you don't give up. You keep pursuing. You keep looking for the truth. So this group of students, we went out. We didn't have DNA. Most murder cases do not have DNA. You shoot a gun, there's no DNA. And we reinvestigated the whole case. And what did we learn? It wasn't Obi. He wasn't even there. It was the pimp of the whorehouse who did the shooting. And the reason our police department didn't want to charge the pimp is because they were using that whorehouse and didn't want to shut it down. How does this story relate at all to what I'm talking about tonight? Well, when Obi walked out of jail, he walked into the arms of the only family he has, which is our students. And then he came to my office. He went into prison and he didn't even have a high school education. And in my office, I have up on the wall, in Hebrew, in the Hebrew lettering, it says, Tzedek, Tzedek, Tirdof, which translates into justice, justice shall you pursue. Obi walks in, and he starts reading, Tzedek, Tzedek, Tirdof, in Hebrew. And I look at him, I go, what? Where? How'd you do that? He said, I had a lot of time to learn. He spent his time in a prison cell where he knew he had been convicted for a crime he had not committed, learning. And so I leave you with that, because I think the greatest tradition of Jewish law is just the tradition of go out and learn. Thank you. So questions, comments, kibitzes, anything. Don't be embarrassed. We're learning here, and you can disagree, sir.
Yes, I've got one question for you. Under the prescription of Jewish law and limits assumptions, is it true that abortion never occurred? The only time war is permissible is in defense.
No, it's not true. There are two types. There's the defense, there's the discretionary war. The discretionary war, which is hardly ever done anymore because we don't really have the great court, Sanhedrin, to authorize it, would allow a war at the time to expand your borders. But you had to get permission from that body to do that. Those were the discretionary wars. But under the law, that is discussed. Yes, excellent question. So is that a prohibition against gay marriage? Our rabbi, my rabbi, does gay marriages. We were the ones in the New York Times, by the way, because he says that's not at all what that line meant. It meant that at the time, in fact, they were probably referring to a certain type of prostitution that was done by men. And certainly, you could have gay marriages, with other sexual acts. So this is a constant area. This is an example, to be honest with you, where Jewish law continues to develop. And so there are people, Jews today, who come from different traditions and say, that's not our approach. We don't agree with that. But in the conservative, we have basically three different movements. We have a reform, a more liberal movement, a conservative, that's where I come from. We never know what we are. And we have a more orthodox tradition. The Orthodox tradition, and the rabbi can speak for himself, would probably not believe in the gay marriage, although there are many gays in the Orthodox community. But certain conservative and liberal Jews fully embrace. It's not that we tolerate. We celebrate gay relationships. In the back. Okay, so I do teach anti-terrorism in the law. I used to call it terrorism in the law, and then I was afraid I'd get prosecuted. And to seriously answer your question, I think this is one of the struggles we have. I think we absolutely, and Jewish law would absolutely say, we have to have the discussion on how much our government can keep secret from us. That is something the community has to decide. But I personally also believe that Jewish law would say that Ed Snowden did not have the right because he had a contractual obligation not to reveal that information, and he violated that. So the big discussion we have to have when you say FISA, some of you don't know about that. How many of you know that there's a secret court in the United States? How many do not know that? We have a secret court, and it has only one side that appears, and it does the foreign intelligence surveillance rulings. And the problem is we don't know a lot about what our government is doing. So under Jewish law, the answer, honest answer is it would not yet answer that. It would need to know the terms of the agreement between Ed Snowden and his employers, and it would say that it doesn't have a First Amendment. That's what we have here, and we have to decide whether or not individuals have the right to trump the rules as a society that we put in place. Yeah, you can follow up. You know, that's fair. So in pollution scenarios, you've hit it on the head, that in environmental scenarios, the community trumps the individual contracts. We've not said that in every single scenario, but that would be a really good argument to raise. In my class, you'd get an A for that, because it raises an inconsistency in the law. All right, other questions? Yes, sir. So the answer is that I don't even know. I don't necessarily believe that's true. I have to tell you from my own experience, I do think judges and jurors tried very hard to do the right thing. The remedy we have under American law, at least, is the jury nullification, right? In the end, the law does not win. In the end, you all win, and you only win if you actually go do your jury service. And 5 minutes before I started this talk, my 25-year-old son called me in a fit because he got picked for a jury. And I said, "You've called the wrong person." So the remedy under American law is to leave it with the people. The remedy under Jewish law has two aspects. One is the idea that you hopefully have put the right rabbis in, so that when they decide the law, because the Sanhedrin didn't just decide cases, it actually decided the law as well. So you took your wisest people and said, infuse it with that. But there is one last thing, and shame on me for not mentioning it. Jewish law has a concept of divine justice. We just don't know what it is. So I can't really teach it to you right now other than saying that moment will come. And in some level of belief, that's the remedy.
What would you say would be the future of Jewish law and its impact on America?
I think that Jewish law will always have an impact on American law because American law, without wanting to admit it, is based upon Jewish law. So you won't necessarily see people walking around saying, gee, I know Jewish law. But if they know what we showed up there, that there's a rule against double jeopardy, they know Jewish law. If they know a rule that says you have to be honest in your business dealings, they know Jewish law. So what it is that maybe Jewish law shouldn't sort of walk around thumping their chests. It's Jewish law. It's just a matter of helping people understand the deeper roots of all our laws. All right, sir. Yes. Yeah, so you, right. I actually lived on a kibbutz. So when I was a teenager, I lived on a kibbutz. I pulled weeds, I grew sugar beets, I worked in a barn with dairy cows, I milked cows, and then wearing sandals, I shoveled what comes out the other end. And so it's a sort of socialism type of thing. Jewish law, I don't think, is based just upon a capitalist model of Jewish law. You can define property rights in different ways. And I can agree to have a contract that gives me joint ownership of things. And I think that's probably what the kibbutzim would say with regard to that. But there was another aspect of your question I want to make sure I answer, which is the on loan, right? So things are on loan to me from God. But right now, my house is on loan to me, not you, right? So I can make a contract based upon my current ownership rights of that home. Okay, this is a really important question, people. Because as I said before, I'm not, and maybe I didn't. I want to tell you, I've never thought Israel has made all the right decisions in what they've done. And I think that individuals have to be held responsible. One thing I will agree with you, and one thing I will disagree with you. I will agree with you that if people use more force, and indiscriminately soldiers use more force or use force against civilians that they weren't supposed to do, that's a crime. I don't agree with you with the idea of occupation, because I think that's a political question more than it is a Jewish law question. And I'm not here today because I'm not qualified to answer that question. But I wouldn't want it to be mixed up with what I did talk about today. I would have to look at it. I don't believe in chemical weapons from anybody. You know what? I don't believe in chemical weapons from anybody. And I don't sort of make an exception that if Israel uses them are okay, or if America uses them, America used them, right? Vietnam, we used them. Shame on us. But we have a movement. And I do want to say this. My daughter, I have a 22-year-old daughter. She's a nice girl and she's available. My son is too. But when she graduated college last year, she went to Cambodia to work in the War Crimes Tribunal in Phnom Penh. And most Americans know very little of the suffering that has happened around the world, but 1 out of every 3 Cambodians was killed, slaughtered by the Khmer Rouge, right? And I thought, wow, that is really the education that we need to have. We need to know what's going on in all of these areas. And part of why I do this talk is so that when you get into that situation, you can ask the questions. Why do we think that this is an ethical way to work? Why do we think it's fair to have a tribunal? You see, the answer to many of your questions is this. We've never gotten it together on who's going to be held accountable. There is an international criminal court. America has not signed on to it. Instead, we do the individual tribunals when we win. Now, for us to get to the hard questions, we probably have to change that paradigm as well. But I go on. You had a question. Yes. Right. No. Jewish law has the defenses that you see. It has duress, coercion. It has insanity. It indeed has those defenses that we have very much come. And then the debate is how much has to be shown, what type of illness qualifies. But there is this idea that only if somebody is mentally capable or of an age that they would be held responsible. Did you ask a question already? All right, I'm going to take two more who didn't, and then I'm going to stick around to answer any questions people have. So the last two questions here and here. So I'm going to repeat the question. Jewish Talmud says that you have to have committed the crime willfully to be responsible. And she says, what about justice for the family in a manslaughter, what we call a negligent homicide situation? You know, Jewish law has a range of punishments. So the real punishment for most crimes was the death penalty. It doesn't mean that there weren't other ways that you would have to pay back by fines, and there was even systems of lashes under Jewish law. So there are gradations in what's your responsibility. But the main thing was to temper, because families were in a blood feud, and that would go on forever. I take your life, you take my life. So it was a way to have a systems of justice so that you could deal and satisfy situations and move on. Okay, basic principle of Jewish life. You are your brother's keeper. And there is very much this idea that if you save one person, you've saved the whole world. Now, historically, when many of these laws were created, we were dealing with tribal societies. You know, you have the tribes. But if you were to ask me whether it's permissible to save somebody of another country, I would say not only is it permissible, it's a mitzvah, it's a commandment. So with that, I just want to thank all of you so much for coming, and I'll stay and answer questions.